Yeah, so after that, there's just a couple of final API calls that we should go over. Close group is pretty straightforward. You close the group. There's one thing to note with the closing of the group. You can choose to destroy temporary highlights that are contained within the group or not. So basically, what happens is in the course of gameplay, highlights that are saved are temporary. They're saved to a temporary location. And as we saw in the summary window, the user has the option to upload those to social media, or they can save them to their local hard disk. If they don't do either of those, and they close that summary window, and then you close the group and delete the highlights, those files will be removed from the hard disk. They're gone forever. So it's something that you should be careful with. In general, I would recommend never deleting highlights from the groups. We happen to have a max file size that is user controlled for the temporary folder, and older files are deleted first. So there's no hard disk blowout reason to delete old highlights. So you should consider the use case that you have for highlights and decide whether or not you want to destroy them or not. But in general, I'd recommend don't. Make sure that you don't. Otherwise, the users will be surprised. They open up the summary window once, they see this list of highlights, and then they close it, and you close the group and destroy that. And maybe later on they open it up and say, what happened? I saw a bunch of videos and they're all gone now. They'll be confused. We do provide a utility function called getNumberOfHighlights, which allows your game to get the number of temporary highlights in a particular group for display, so that you can tell the user, hey, look, you have 5 highlights as a UI in your group if you want to. And then we have some best practices. Yeah, so that's basically it for the API. There is no more complexity than that, and there's no render flow or post-processing or any other issues. We purely capture the end result of the frame buffer, so the video is exactly what the user is seeing while they're playing, captured in video form. But there are a couple of best practices that we have around the use of highlights that I wanted to cover real quick. It will save you some trouble. Yeah, so you do want to keep them short. I mentioned there's no hard disk blowout fears, and that is true. But if you have extremely long highlights, then that means with a fixed hard disk size in the temp folder, you will have a fixed number of highlights. And so the larger your highlights, the fewer the highlights you'll be able to save. So if you have like a 1 gigabyte max limit that the user sets this, not the game. So if the user drags that size down to 1 gig and you're capturing like 5-minute videos, then you're not going to have very many of them. So keep your short, concise highlights. It also allows them to upload those highlights quicker. Like if you have small videos, they'll have a small video size, which means it'll be quicker for them to upload to social media. Users don't generally like to upload really long videos. They like to, for this particular use case, they like highlights. I mean, that's why the name is highlights. So be a good citizen in that respect. This is kind of an example of the GFE. I talked about the permissions dialog over here. This is an example of the in GFE configuration, which is custom per game for highlights. So there's a global highlights enable disable. There's a game specific enable disable, which is controlled by this dialog over here. And then there are the highlight specific enable disables, which is controlled, the default value is controlled by that user interest boolean that I mentioned at configure time. At the bottom, we have where on my hard disk I want to save my temporary highlights. So this allows the users to review them if they want, or to save them to a different drive if they want. And this is the slider that allows them to control how much disk space that temp folder is allowed to use. Yeah, and so keep the highlights themselves to interesting things. Like, yeah, single kills are interesting, and a lot of games do record single kills, but they're not the most interesting things. The most interesting things are like the triple kills or the really unique items that people find and do in the game. So definitely consider putting more of those and less of the thing that happens every minute. Because if you have a game that has a high number of kills and each kill is not particularly interesting and you're saving every kill individually, you're going to have 15, 20 different kill videos, and the user's not going to find that interesting enough to upload. But if you had every 10 kills, like 10 kills in a row, or some high number, or an interesting type of kills, long-range kills, or kills with a unique weapon, or melee kills, or just punch kills, or something like that, those are more interesting highlights that users would be likely to want to upload. So you don't want to just burden the user with many highlights, then they're not sure what's good to upload and what's not. So consider how to make a highlight interesting. Yeah, and try and use groups. So we provide the grouping mechanism that allows you to group highlights by level, and we allow you to filter highlights based on the significance and tags when you're viewing them in the summary window. So you use those configuration parameters to give the user some choice about what they're seeing and how to filter. And then we do provide these buttons as UI art, as well as some UI recommendations on how to present highlights and where to present highlights in the documentation. So definitely consider that, and feel free to use these art assets in your game as you like. And don't show the summary window in match. Like, don't show the summary window to the player when they're getting killed or shot at, or otherwise have to be distracted. Wait for a time when the game is paused. Like in an RPG scenario, maybe at the save point when the game is paused. In a match scenario, it's at the end of the game or in the lobby. So find a place where the user has plenty of time to interact with the UI, to upload videos, and to review what has been captured so far. The SDK itself, I mentioned, was on our NVIDIA GameWorks site, so you can get access similar to Ansel. Sign up at our developer website, register your Git user, and then you'll get full access to the Highlights SDK, Ansel SDKs, all the plugin for UE4 and everything. As well, the Git itself has a very comprehensive integration guide covering all the topics I talked about today and a lot more, including FAQs about common issues and questions that developers have around highlights. It also includes a C++ code sample with an example integration into one of the Microsoft DirectX tutorial code bases. And finally, register your game. So we have this new portal which allows you to register your game into GFE, which will provide onboarding. So what happens is, for highlights, it goes through GFE and saves through the GFE system. So if your game is unregistered, your video highlights will be saved into a unregistered game group, and it won't be associated with your game. So you definitely encourage you to register your game. Most popular games that have come out, we try and register them anyway in GFE, but if you go ahead and register your game in advance, it gets us a head start. And one other thing to note is, right now, this is not the case, but it will be in some time in the future that unregistered games will have watermarking on the videos that were saved. Right now, it's not the case, but I've been told that they're going to put that in at some point. So that's another incentive for you to register. And there's no disincentive to register because the registration is auto-approved. There is no whitelisting. It's just you register so that we know about it. We get a profile which will allow us to list it in GFE, which allows us to save settings per game. So please do this. In the Git, there's definitely a more detailed explanation about all the steps you would go through at the portal site to register your game in case there's any questions. But I just did it this morning as a test, and it's really, really straightforward.